What do you think about the possibility? Because I think that Trump has probably tried doing that from the very beginning of his presidency, of trying to sever the alliance between Russia and China. In this particular time, possibly also acting on the fact that with high oil and gas prices, the moment that Russia could go back and sell to the traditional outlets of the Western markets, that would clearly mean a lot of revenue. Before you answer, I wanted to suggest that, given that we both come from a Marxist tradition, if if actually looking at how the structure of the property of the energy sector in Russia might help shedding a different light onto this, because similarly to what you were saying about China, I mean, Russia is definitely not as, I would say, it's not a socialist country, whereas China is, but still, there isn't really a subordination of state objectives to the ones of a capitalist class. So, if this element could help answering this question about the reverse Kissinger that has been like sort of like floating for a very long time.
Okay, great stuff. Nice meaty question to finish with. I think the framing for all of this has been set most famously by Brzezinski, the former national security advisor under the Carter administration. He wrote a very famous book, The Grand Chessboard, that was released in 1997, and there's a crucial phrase, crucial couple of sentences from it that I'll read. The most dangerous scenario would be a grand coalition of China, Russia, and perhaps Iran. It would be reminiscent in scale and scope of the challenge that was once posed by the Sino-Soviet bloc. So he's obviously talking about between 1950 and 1960, 1960 being when the Sino-Soviet split came out into the open, and that bloc essentially de facto fell apart. So this most dangerous scenario, a grand coalition of China, Russia, and perhaps Iran, and how timely to be talking about that when the US and Israel have gone to war against Iran. I think dealing with this situation is the US regime's long-term strategic priority. I think the key strategists in the US have decided that the war against Russia in Ukraine is not working, right? And it's clearly a distraction. The facts on the ground are perfectly clear that Russia is making steady advances in Donbass, in Mariupol, in the other areas that are contested in that situation. And the US wants to fight on one front and not fight on two fronts. So it wants to take confrontation with Russia off the table. And you referenced the whole reverse Kissinger thing. It's clear that what they're trying to do is to revive Kissinger's triangular diplomacy, befriending one of the two major enemies in order to isolate the other one, right? And whereas the Soviet Union was considered to be the number one enemy in the 1970s, nowadays China is seen as the main threat. China's the existential threat, right? China's, as we were saying, the world's largest economy. It's the largest trading partner of most of the world's countries. It's the driving force behind this trajectory towards a multipolar world. And Russia is a very serious power as well. But it's not the main threat. It's not the existential threat. It's China that's emerging as the most innovative, the most dynamic, the most influential, and overall, I think the most important player in the global economy and global politics. Apart from anything else, China's economy is 6 times the size of Russia's. China accounts for more than 30% of global manufacturing, and it's even providing competition to the cutting edge of the US economy in terms of Silicon Valley digital infrastructure, and it's doing so in a completely sovereign way. And and last but not least, and it's something you've mentioned, China is a socialist country and therefore poses an ideological threat along with that basic economic competition. And so China and Russia working together in an alliance is considered to be an absolute disaster, the thing that must be avoided at all costs. And you had that, you saw that in Trump's interview with Tucker Carlson a year or so ago, where he openly stated, you never want Russia and China uniting. He said, I'm going to have to ununite them, and I think I can do that. I can ununite them, right? So this is Trump's vision, and that's clearly a big part of what's driving this shifting strategy, and that's very much consistent with the so-called realist approach to international relations in the United States in general. And in terms of making up with Russia and dealing with the Ukraine situation, I think Trump has actually wanted to pursue this from the beginning. But of course, neocon ideology and Russophobia, this deep, visceral hatred of Russia is very deeply entrenched in US ruling circles. So, the administration's having significant difficulties getting what it wants there. There's also an element of like the sunk cost fallacy. Like they've thrown so many resources into this stupid war. Literally hundreds of billions of dollars worth of weapons have been provided to Kiev, and these weapons have just been, more or less instantly destroyed by the Russians. So they've sunk in a vast quantity of capital, and the returns are going to be incredibly low. There's also the European factor. The European countries, particularly Britain, particularly France, particularly Germany. The Ukraine crisis has made them feel relevant again. It's made them feel like, oh, we can get the band back together. We can have the West. We can have NATO. NATO can be relevant. We can be part of the team. Whereas for a US administration, a US ruling class that's really much more focused on the epochal battle against China, Europe is of very marginal relevance. But that dynamic does mean that the European leaders, the European Union, Britain, France, Germany, have been a factor in maintaining the US in this absurd war. So in terms of how the Iran situation is going to affect things, I think, we're already seeing massive increases in energy prices. A month or so ago, the cost of oil was $60 per barrel. It's now, just yesterday, gone over $100 per barrel. There's no doubt in my mind whatsoever that it will soon be at $150 and go even, potentially go even higher. By the time it reaches $200 per barrel, that shuts down large parts of the global economy, right? That's not just about you or I being able to drive our car or heat our apartments. It's about whether manufacturing can run, whether services can run. Potentially vast portions of the global economy could simply collapse, and that's a reflection of the Iranian armed forces blocking or de facto blocking the Strait of Hormuz. It reflects reduced output from Kuwait and Qatar. It reflects the fact that any insurance costs for transport of fossil fuels in the Persian Gulf region are going to be, stratospheric. They're going to be prohibitively expensive, right? So I'm sure all of that is going to add up to some kind of deal being put on the table for Russia. The US and Europe have worked desperately over the course of the last 4 years to end all kind of energy ties between Russia and Europe, between Russia and India, between Russia and other countries. And that's all going to have to be reversed now, because they need to do whatever they can to get the oil prices and the gas prices down. The US has already said to India, okay, you can buy oil from Russia again. You can buy gas from Russia again, which is hilarious because they only agreed with India about a month ago that it wouldn't buy oil and gas from Russia. And of course, Russia, at the end of the day, there's no judgment there. Russia needs to sell its energy. Russia needs to sell its energy resources. So there is scope for some kind of deal. But the Russians are in a very strong negotiating position. Why would they agree, for example, to price their oil and price their gas in US dollars? You know, they've literally been cut out of the SWIFT system. It would be mad for them to peg their natural resources to the dollar again. They already sell vast quantities of hydrocarbons to China. It's priced in renminbi. They already have currency swap agreements with a whole bunch of countries. So the US might be able to bring the price of oil down a bit, but it's not going to be any kind of sort of geopolitical game changer. And yeah, like, what can the US really offer Russia? They can offer it some sanctions relief. Some sanctions relief would be good. They can offer it some security guarantees, i.e. they can promise that Ukraine will never be a member of NATO. And those are good things. Russia wants those things, and those things are important for the whole, security of the world. But actually, Russia's kind of been solving those problems by itself. With regard to sanctions, Russia's been carrying out what I think you could call its own pivot to Asia, right? Its economy is growing very fast. It's massively expanded its trade with China and with other countries. The sanctions have been so extreme that Russia kind of moves in a different economic universe now, such that sanctions are not as important as they were a few years ago. In terms of security guarantees, again, Russia's, it's ensuring its own security. Like, as the Russians say, this generation is fighting to make sure that the next generation doesn't have to make sure that Ukraine is never again going to be a launch pad for an invasion of Russia. And it's achieving that aim for itself. The US imposing these massive sanctions on Russia, cutting Russia out of SWIFT, it's kind of like, it's like a bee, a bee that's only got one sting. It uses the sting and then it's got nothing left. The US and the West have used their one sting, and now they've got nothing left. The sting didn't have the desired effect. Russia's still, Russia's one of the fastest growing economies in the world. So Russia's doing quite well, and a big part of the reason for that is that China-Russia bilateral trade is enormous. The two countries have got numerous shared projects. They've exchanged goods and services in rubles and in renminbi to the extent of hundreds of billions of dollars worth a year. Russia is a key player in BRICS. It's a key player in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And that's really where the future lies. The US can try a reverse Kissinger all at once, but I just can't see it working. Because you could say back in the early 70s, with the Kissinger visit to China in 1971, the Nixon visit the next year, the rapprochement, the establishment of bilateral relations at the end of the decade under Carter, China, to some degree, it was already had the Soviet Union as an enemy, so it gained a friend in that situation. It gained a better relationship with the United States while maintaining a fairly deep hatred that existed at that time, very sadly, tragically even, between the Soviet Union and China. Whereas reverse Kissinger in this situation would be Russia gaining a very unreliable friend in the form of the United States that you couldn't rely on at all, even for a second, and losing a much better friend, an incredibly dependable friend in the form of the People's Republic of China, and a relationship that is really going incredibly well. So I don't see that being successful. And in terms of the class dynamics that you mentioned, I think that's essentially an internal question in Russian politics, but I think it's a question that's really been settled. That you had a domestic comprador bourgeoisie that was very much tied to the private sector, and that was very, very much tied to this kind of kleptocratic system that emerged out of the ashes of the Soviet Union and the wholesale theft of the Soviet people's collective property, right? But that domestic comprador bourgeoisie has been completely discredited. I think in as much as you can personalize these things. I would say that domestic comprador bourgeoisie is represented by Boris Yeltsin, and national independent bourgeoisie is represented in the figure of Vladimir Putin. And that latter category has been strengthened, has been empowered, and has won that battle essentially. I don't think there's any contest around that anymore. The people of Russia can, or at least the vast majority of them, can see perfectly well that the future lies with the East and not with the West. And Russia in its current iteration is oriented very much towards multipolarity, is oriented very much towards cooperation with China. It's oriented very much towards resisting hegemonism and aggression. So I can't see that reverse Kissinger has any future.